What would you do if the very house you spent 6 years and $78,000 saving for your parents was suddenly gifted to your younger sibling like it cost nothing at all? No warning, no thank you, just a smile, a speech, and a signed deed. I was the one who sacrificed vacations, drained my retirement, and held their future together. And one afternoon, they handed it all away, like I was never part of the story. But what happened next? That they never saw coming. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about boundaries, awakening, and the moment I finally said, no more. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you'll see why sometimes the hardest choice becomes the beginning of your freedom. Margaret had always done what was expected of her. The oldest of three, she learned early on that being the responsible one meant putting everyone else's needs ahead of her own. So when her parents, Ed and Louise, fell behind on their mortgage and faced foreclosure, she didn't hesitate. She had just taken an early retirement package from her corporate HR job, and while she had planned some travel, maybe buy a little cottage upstate, those dreams were quickly shelved. Her parents were in their 70s, and the idea of them being homeless was unthinkable. Margaret dipped into her 401k, paid off $12,000 in back taxes, another $18,000 in overdue mortgage payments, and over the next 5 years, quietly took on their property insurance, upkeep costs, and utility bills. By the time the books were balanced, the total sat at just over $78,000. She never told her siblings the full amount. She never asked for gratitude. But she kept a quiet record in a manila folder tucked inside her home filing cabinet. Every receipt, every check, every late-night call she took when her parents' heating went out or their water line froze. She didn't do it for thanks. She did it because it felt like the right thing to do. Still, what Margaret didn't realize, and what so many people her age understand all too well, is that doing the right thing doesn't guarantee you'll be treated right in return. Giving from your heart doesn't always buy you loyalty. It's a hard truth, but one that every selfless caregiver has to reckon with eventually. When you give everything, sometimes people expect you to keep giving, even after it breaks you. The lesson here, one Margaret would only come to understand later, is that helping your family is noble, but protecting your future is necessary. It was supposed to be a celebration. Margaret's nephew, her younger brother Tommy's only son, had just graduated from college, and the whole family had gathered for a backyard barbecue at her parents' home. The old colonial still looked beautiful in the golden light of late June, and Margaret found herself smiling as she helped her mother set out paper plates and iced tea, proud to see the house still standing strong after all these years, and knowing she had a hand in saving it. But just as they were cutting the graduation cake, her father tapped a spoon against a glass and called for everyone's attention. "We've got a little announcement to make," he said, beaming. Her mother nodded beside him, eyes shining. "As Tommy and Melissa begin this exciting new chapter together," she said, glancing at her son and his fiancée, "we want them to have a strong foundation, so we decided to sign the deed over to them. They'll be moving in by the end of the summer." Margaret stood frozen, the paper plate in her hand trembling. She felt like the wind had been knocked out of her. Her house, the one she'd saved, was being handed over like a party favor, and she wasn't even told ahead of time. There was no mention of the sacrifices she had made, no acknowledgement of the thousands she'd poured in. The room erupted in congratulations, claps and laughter, and Margaret forced a smile. But inside, something cracked. She excused herself to the kitchen, blaming the heat. The lesson she learned that day hit like a sledgehammer. When people don't see your sacrifices, they don't value your role in their success. Her parents hadn't asked. They hadn't considered her. They'd simply assumed she'd be fine, just like she always was. And in that moment, Margaret began to understand a painful truth. If you don't speak up for your own worth, people will write you out of the story without a second thought. Margaret didn't choose to be the responsible one. It was simply assigned to her. From the time she was 10 years old and asked to help change her baby sister's diapers, the tone was set. Margaret was a helper, the fixer, the dependable one. It was never a role she resented. She took pride in it, actually, but decades later, that identity came at a cost. While her siblings went off to explore passions, live impulsively, and start families, Margaret stayed tethered to her parents' needs. She visited every Sunday, organized their medications, paid bills when they forgot, and handled every leak, repair, and doctor's visit like a project manager in a crumbling office. Her brother Tommy, on the other hand, stopped by once a month, if that. Her sister moved across the country years ago. Still, when it came time to make a generous family gesture, her parents didn't look to Margaret, the one who kept their heads above water. They looked to Tommy. Why? Because he needed it more. He had kids, bills, a struggling career. Margaret? She had a condo, a pension, and no kids. What could she possibly need? That assumption, that because she wasn't drowning, she didn't deserve a life raft, stung deeper than any insult, and it reflects a pattern many in their 50s and 60s know too well. When you're the strong one, people forget to check if you're tired. The quiet, competent child gets taken for granted, not because people are cruel, but because they're comfortable. That's when Margaret began to see her worth through a new lens. Just because you can carry the load doesn't mean you should. If you never set boundaries, people will treat your kindness like an obligation. And if you're not careful, you'll wake up one day with a full file of receipts and an empty heart. After the reunion, Margaret couldn't sleep. The betrayal gnawed at her like termites in a beam. How could they give the house away like that? Why didn't they talk to her first? A week later, still feeling the burn of that announcement, Margaret went into her old files, the same manila folder she kept with every payment record. As she flipped through the bank statements, she remembered something odd. Her mother once asked her to set up online access to their joint account so she could help pay bills directly. Out of curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, Margaret logged in, expecting to find empty accounts. What she found instead made her stomach twist. Over $35,000 had been sitting untouched in a savings account. It had been there for years, slowly accumulating, quietly growing. And yet they had asked her, begged her, to cover their mortgage, taxes, even a roof repair. Worse, she saw large transfers leading up to her nephew's graduation, expenses for catering a new grill, and what looked like a deposit for a luxury honeymoon package for Tommy and Melissa. Margaret sat back in her chair, heart pounding. It wasn't just neglect. It was manipulation. All that talk about being in crisis had been a tactic. They had the means. They just didn't want to touch their own comfort. They saw Margaret as the insurance policy. It was a devastating realization, but it gave her something she hadn't had before, clarity. And it's a lesson more of us need to learn, especially later in life, when financial security is hard-won and time is short. If you're supporting someone financially, protect yourself, put agreements in writing, monitor where your money is going, and above all, never assume shared blood means shared values. Financial boundaries aren't selfish, they're self-preservation. Margaret knew it was time. The resentment had begun to fester into something uglier, something corrosive. So she called her parents and asked to meet in person. They agreed, thinking maybe she wanted to apologize for leaving the reunion early. Instead, she walked into their living room with a folder full of paperwork and a voice steadier than it had been in years. "I need to talk about the house," she said, calmly but firmly. Her father's face stiffened. Her mother bristled. But Margaret didn't flinch. She laid out the documents, every payment, every deposit, every utility bill she'd covered for 5 years. Then she opened her laptop and displayed the savings account she had access to. "You told me you were broke," she said, "but this says otherwise." Her parents stammered, tried to explain, "We were saving it in case something happened." But Margaret didn't let the conversation veer into guilt or excuses. "Something did happen," she said. "You let your daughter drain her retirement fund while you held on to yours." The room went silent. For once, she didn't feel it. And then she made her boundary clear. "I'm not asking for the house. I'm asking for acknowledgement. And from this day forward, I will not be your fallback." Her voice cracked, but she held her ground. "You got 2 other kids. If I'm not good enough to deserve honesty, I'm not good enough to be your emergency plan." That moment changed everything. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cruel, but it was honest. For the first time, Margaret showed her family what accountability looked like, and the lesson she walked away with is one she hoped every listener would take to heart. Clarity isn't conflict. Setting boundaries doesn't make you a bad daughter, a bad son, or a bad sibling. It makes you a whole person. And no matter how old you are, it's never too late to speak up for yourself.